I'm Catherine Kingsley.
And I'm Catherine Stern.
And this is
Contemplating Culture,
a missionary walk through a secular age. Together we journey through A Secular Age by Charles Taylor, a book looking at the history and philosophy of how the world got where it is, and the impacts of our contemporary culture for us today as missionaries.
And we're inviting you to join the conversation.
Hello and welcome to Contemplating Culture.
Hello everyone.
So it's good to be back, and we are looking this week at the second of three kind of ways that Taylor says the social imaginary mutates kind of away from politics. So things that kind of become independent entities away from the polity is what he calls it, but effectively like the space where politics is happening.
So let's remember what social imaginaries are. So a social imaginary, as I remember it, is how I think the world is and should be, basically.
Especially how we, as a people, kind of view society and how it is and how it should be and what's reasonable to be expected. So even if something hasn't happened yet, it doesn't surprise us so much because it's within our imaginary of what's possible.
So in this case, when we're talking about a mutation away from politics, what we're saying is that politics was the social imaginary, the way that people assumed that the world worked. And there's a mutation away from how that works, well, how people see.
Yes. Yeah, that I guess, you had religion and politics were the two kind of things, and everything was drawn back into them. So in our last episode, we talked about economics and the economy as something that starts to be independent. So in fact, we talked about how the government starts to service the economy as a thing rather than the economy being something that is coming under. So it's these things that start to take independence away from.
Okay, so what we're talking about today is another area that, if you like, has developed as part of our social imaginary of something that a way that we expect the world works, that is now separate from religion, politics,
Yes.
The economy.
Yes. So what we're talking about today is the public sphere. So the public sphere, not that things didn't happen in public before this mutation, but Taylor kind of highlights a couple of ways that this takes on a life of its own, ways that this is different. So, for example, before you might have used to have discussions that would happen, but they would be feeding into the politics, or they would be about religion, like a council or something like that. So you'd have all the things, but they were part of the process of religion or of politics. Whereas this, and we'll look at it, there's a couple of kind of unique things about this. So when we're talking about the public sphere, he's kind of talking about a meeting place for the members of society where they discuss matters of common interest. But it's not just like a club and we all go talk about the football game or something like that. It's wider than that. It's where we start to have, and there's two kind of elements that he puts in this. So there's an internal element to the discussion that our conversation that we're having about it is interfering with another conversation that's happening about it, that all these connected conversations are happening. And then there's an external element being there's some kind of common material that we're having these discussions about that's propagating the ideas. So people that you've never met, you can still be forming a common opinion with them. And so we're talking really around the 1800s here and the rise of print media. So the kind of print capitalism that comes about where you've got the newspaper and things like that, that in this town, someone's reading the same article that someone's reading in another town. And within those towns, they're having conversations, and those conversations start to interrefer, and they're using this common material for those discussions.
Hence the power of the media, really, that if I write an article and it catches people's attention, then my angle is either something people are going to agree with or disagree with, and shape then many, many different people's opinions.
Yes. And one of the other things he says about this is that it landed in the right cultural context as well. So we've got here, I guess, the movement of the Enlightenment kind of coming about, where you've got the kind of enlightened class of society that are having these reasonable discussions. They're exchanging ideas and opinions at a kind of intellectual level.
Yeah, so like basically with the rise of education, more and more people are able to read and form a logical reasoning based on what they're reading.
Yes. And so one of the things that he says is because of this element, there's a new sense of legitimacy to public opinion. That it's not just, oh, that's just what you think and I can disregard it, but it's now becoming its own entity with legitimacy. So even though it doesn't have decision-making power, what starts to happen is that in the same way that the government needs to pay attention to what's happening in the economy as a separate thing, the government is now having to pay attention to what's happening in public opinion as a separate thing to itself.
And you can see that today every now and again when you have a leadership spill in a party. So suddenly we have a new prime minister and there hasn't been an election, but the government potentially has been looking at public opinion and going, if we continue with this leader, we're in trouble, toss him out, get someone else in.
Yes, exactly that kind of thing. So what Taylor says is that government now, because of the new kind of legitimacy of public opinion, is that government can't just have original consent, they need to have ongoing consent of public opinion. And that's exactly what it might look like in practice, that midway through a term that they've committed to, that they've been voted in for, suddenly there's a leadership spill. And in Australia, we've had, I couldn't even count how many, like in my lifetime, in a new way, I think, than was kind of happening before my lifetime.
Like I remember probably around the time you were born, there was one, and I was in primary school and I was shocked by it. But, over recent years we've had one after another, after another, after another.
And there's something about, I guess, that's then shaping the social imaginary, right? Whereas first you were shocked, so it didn't really sit in the social imaginary, whereas now it kind of is, that it's like, oh, they're doing pretty well. They made it through their term without a leadership spill. Like, they must be listening to public opinion. They must be in favour with public opinion. So one of the other things that happens around this time is that the government, therefore, is open to scrutiny a lot more. So their proceedings starting to become more public, and the public has a right to scrutinise the proceedings of these kind of Western governments. So it's not that public opinion has its own power, but it's that where the power sits needs to listen to what's happening in public opinion. And it's very much around, one of the phrases that Taylor has is that reason tames power. And so he says there's two kind of things that happen for that reason, that this, we've been voted in by this public, so we should listen to what they're saying. We should listen to public opinion. But then he's also saying, and because they're an enlightened public, we're morally bound to listen to them. That the government's now bound in a kind of non-explicit contract to be listening to public opinion, that it would be very unwise to not listen to what's happening in public opinion, to carry on as though it was independent of public opinion, that it's, even though public opinion's independent and can do whatever it wants, the government is not independent from public opinion. So one of the things that is kind of unique about this, as we were saying, is that it's not built on religion or politics, that the discussions that we're having aren't feeding directly back into religion or politics. We're kind of just having these discussions, in the 18th century because we're enlightened people and we like exchanging our ideas. And so Taylor talks about, I guess, this sense of them being secular discussion, in the sense that he says secular being of the age. So it's like a time limited. It's a discussion with no link to a higher purpose or a higher sense of time, anything happening outside of now. And I think, I don't know, like a way that I started to understand this was, Facebook memories come up and you see something that's totally out of context and you're like, oh, that was part of 15 years ago or 10 years ago kind of conversation, or when people's, old tweets get brought back and it's like, wow, that's really out of context. So that's the kind of thing he means, I think, by secular, that it's kind of like of the time, of the age that it's happening in, and it's not caring about, you know, how it's going to be received in 10 years' time or even a week's time, because it's time limited now. And I guess we've seen the rise of media in, you know, since the 18th century. So 18th century it was print media, but since then we've seen radio, we've seen television, and then with the internet we see, you know, just a whole range of social media explosions. So that, I guess, print media, the conversation can happen maybe, you know, like across a week. Everyone's read the weekend paper, and we have conversations during the week about, you know, what was happening. And then maybe with radio and TV, it's like a, you know, maybe there was a daily news kind of thing. So we'd have, you know, conversations during the day. Whereas now, you know, like, I think sometimes if you join a group chat an hour after it's been going off, you're totally out of context kind of thing. Like that, there's, yeah, I think the speed of the development of this public opinion is much quicker, I think, possibly than it was 100, 200 years ago.
And not just the speed, but like the distance. Like, I could be having a conversation online with someone on the other side of the world, and the public opinion wave that could rise up around us can have global consequences. I don't think that the print media in the 18th century was quite that.
Yeah. And so I guess today I was thinking we could talk about some of the elements of what this looks like now. So I gave a talk last week at a high school's kind of youth festival day called Following Jesus in a Secular Age. So looking at kind of some of these ideas that we discuss on the podcast, but taking them into the high school kind of sphere, knowing full well that most of the kids in the room probably don't follow Jesus, but that was the name of the talk. And one of the things I was talking about that I think is really relevant here is, like, I didn't talk about public sphere so much, but the concept being social conscience. So I think for them, the world is very much, they sit and wait and they can see what everyone in the world is forming as the public opinion, and then the weight of that opinion is so strong that it's really difficult for them to do or say anything against that public opinion. So to be a dissenter of the public opinion is actually quite dangerous. It has a lot of social implications for them and all kinds of things. And just the whole realm of online bullying, that if you dissent with public opinion, you're probably not saying anything. But what's happening, and I was talking to them about it, I was like, well, how often have you heard someone kind of giving the argument of like, I saw something or I read something, and they're like, isn't that the only way to kind of have a discussion? I was like, well, actually there's other, you know, moral principles that you could be bringing into your discussion, but I guess the way that social conscience has kind of superseded or led to the neglect of the development of a personal moral conscience, personal thought, discussion, that I can let society have the discussion and I can just jump on whatever they decide is, you know, how we're going to vote on this issue, or, you know, how we're going to stand behind this person and not that person or whatever.
It's quite fascinating when you think about it, because if there's a whole world of people doing that, really there's probably two people's opinions involved here, and then other people slowly jumping on board with one or other. But they're not jumping on board necessarily because they've done their research. They might be jumping on board because that person's my friend and I'm going to support them no matter what, or because that's happening in the background of my family and it makes me feel awkward, so I think this is where I'm going to stand, or I want to look good in that person's eyes, so I'm going to do what I think they want. Like, the actual how people are forming the reasons for lining up on different sides when it's just happening on social media is completely hidden.
Yes.
So you're sitting back and waiting is sort of waiting for people to declare a stance, but like the reasons that you could, yeah, just fascinates me.
Yes. And one of the things I was talking about with these kids was, you know, trying to help them understand the buffered self without, you know, using that language in a way that they could understand. Kind of saying, like, I'm putting my curated self out there, and you're putting your curated self out there, and they're interacting in this middle space. Meanwhile, I'm over here and have no idea what you actually think. and actually I'm too scared for you to see what I actually think. And this is just being propagated, you know, with every interaction that we're having. So one of the things I was saying to them was, you know, for my generation, we're the last ones, you know, that are going to remember what it was like to not have personal devices. And they're going to be the first ones who don't know what it's like to not have a personal device. And one of the implications of that is that they're having a lot of their interactions are happening first. A lot of the things they're finding out about is happening first through digital means. Whereas I'm, you know, grew up in a world where that wasn't the case. So I kind of see digital as a addition, whereas for them it's the primary. And I think the classic for me is Pope Francis talking about, you know, being out, people have waited hours to see him. He puts out his hand to shake their hand and they put up their phone to take a photo because the photo is more real for them. And I don't know, like, I'm always checking because I'm just guessing a lot of the time or using intuition, I guess, to try to put pieces together. So I said to them, I was like, is this real? Would you say that it's something that, like, unless you've captured something digitally, it doesn't feel real? And they're like, oh yeah, like unless it's digital somehow, it's not really real. And I was like, wow. So what that means then is that even if this discussion isn't digital, it's not real. That the understanding of how to have a non-digital discussion is diminishing. The understanding of how to engage with the discussion, to watch it unfold in a non-digital platform. But then I think there's also not a lot of education happening in how to have that digital discussion, because there's, I think you were saying, like, two kind of categories of people: the people who care about the repercussions of what's happening for them in the digital space, and the people that don't. And the people that don't care, they're the ones that get to say whatever they want, and the people that do care are really carefully curating. I can't even like a post in case someone sees it and then gets offended by my liking of that post, kind of thing. Like,
yeah, and what strikes me about all of this is how much unreality is entering into this. Like the digital, the fact that if something's not real unless it's digital, but digital is also something I can fake. So, you know, when I look on the news most days on Google News, I'm really lazy with the news, I scroll down to the bottom and there's a fact check, you know. This photo that's going around the world is not of what it's saying it is, it's actually of this. Or this claim that such and such said this is not actually true, it's out of context, or whatever
yes.
it is. And there's something about that curated self that, well, I want you to think that I got close to the Pope. I was actually like 20 rows back and he was a dot in the distance, but I'm going to steal this person's photo and post it as my own, or I'm going to just create with the best digital media that I've got a photo that looks like that's me and the Pope. And unless you're really, really good at detecting the difference, you're not going to be able to tell it's photoshopped. Like this whole, the safety of the digital world, of actually believing things.
Yes, there's a weight that sits there. If you've seen it or heard it enough, I mean, have you heard that in the average human's lifetime they eat 3 or 4 spiders or something in their sleep?
Yeah.
So however many it was, I can't remember the exact number, and I don't even know if this is true, right? But I read something somewhere, right? This is how I have the conversation. I read something somewhere that said that someone made up that fact and put it in the newspaper just to see how far it would propagate, right? And so I've heard, and so if someone told me that, I'd be like, what's your fact for that? And they're like, oh, I read it somewhere. Where did you read it? What was the source of that? You know, that I think we become just the weight of, there's so many different avenues that we're getting this information, that to fact check it is exhausting. I don't want to have to fact check everything. So I just kind of receive. And so if you're doing that then with morality, it becomes quite dangerous, I think, because I haven't reasoned through, I haven't gone to the source, I've neglected that part of, and so that's just like a silly example. But if you're taking that to, you know, important things, that my personal engagement, and I was saying, like, I think we've got a rise then of like silent observing of the discussion. It's much more difficult in the 1800s to be a silent observer kind of thing, because the conversation has to happen face to face.
Mm.
So I've got to be in the room with the people and close enough that I can hear them talking about it to be engaged, right? Whereas now I can watch the entire thing happen. I can see who's posting about it. I can see who's reacting to it. All of that can be happening. And whether or not my non-react is also an engagement in the conversation. My reaction is an engagement in the conversation, but the whole thing can happen and no one ever has to know what's going on inside of me.
Which is sort of understandable. Like, I've found that, I mean, apart from the time it takes to actually be active on social media, which I'm not prepared to give, like the fear of having to engage further by engaging in the first place, like putting a reaction. Like if I react to something somebody says, or I put an opinion out there, I then have to be prepared to engage with someone else's reaction to that.
Yep.
And all the repercussions that might flow from that. So there's a really strong incentive to stand back. It's safer. Just watch. That there's a fear of, I could lose friends over this, I could end up, being the latest controversy and having to put up with a lot of other people's opinions that I don't know because of this.
And I think one of the other elements, right, so if we look at the comparison, I think even when Taylor wrote this book, I think it came out 2007, so that's actually a bit of time now, and I think the world's even changed in that time, and then you look back to the 18th century, so say 18th century, the conversations are happening face to face, which means that they really are able to be limited to the age that they're being talked about in. One of the problems I think we have now is that what you say can be taken wildly out of context down the track. That you have to be careful, not just for the current reactions, but for any future developments in the world, and the way that once you put something digitally, we know you lose control of it. It's there forever. It's not the same as speaking something to someone face to face that you have a personal relationship with. It's now sitting out there in the ether, and some of us were watching the other night, there's a show on Binge at the moment called Strife, talking about the rise of women in print media kind of thing, and then the digital sphere. And that's one of the things they have to kind of deal with, is the fact that whatever you put out into the digital sphere is there forever.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I was listening to an audiobook back in COVID times about shaming, people being publicly shamed and particularly trolled on the internet or cancelled or whatever, and how people deal with it. And it was quite interesting. Towards the end of the book, he was describing companies that, for presumably large fees, will rehabilitate your digital persona. And literally what they do is say, I don't know, I've said something controversial which I need essentially erased from the public mind. They'll talk to me until they find some really innocuous thing like, I have a cat. And then they will literally bombard my Facebook, Instagram, whatever it is, with cute cat pictures or whatever, videos, that sort of thing, so that somebody who's, for a job interview investigating me would have to scroll back so many pages before they found the controversial stuff that I can't get rid of on a Google search or just, scrolling down my social media, that they're unlikely to find it and it's not actually going to affect my future.
Yeah. I think anyone listening to this knows exactly what we're talking about. They know the weight, they know the fear, they know the implications, they're seeing it play out, and it can feel quite discouraging, I guess. And before we got on air, we were kind of talking about, well, how do we bring this into a place of being a missionary in this sphere? Like, we're born for this time. This is the time that we're called to live in. And I think one of the things you were talking about first off was just getting in touch with our own sense of how are we curating ourselves? What role does fear play in our lives? Our capacity to be a witness.
Yeah, and it's just interesting, I think, that, for someone who has stood up in front of the world and made vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. You know, the whole world knows I'm a missionary. And yet my capacity to stand back in the social media world and just let it happen, not comment, that kind of thing, because I don't want to get engaged. I don't want to pay the price for disagreeing with that person publicly or whatever it is. So I just let it happen.
Yes. And I think...
So I'm not in any way saying that we have to be active on social media or in that world defending the faith, but I guess I'm asking the question, putting it out there, you know, what stops me from commenting on these things? Is the fullness of the expression of my faith online that I don't press like when my cousin puts up photos of his gay parties with his friends or something like that? Where's the line? Where's the appropriate space for me to express what I believe?
Yeah. And I guess one of our encouragements coming out of today would be that is a question, I guess, for you to engage with personally. I don't think that deferring to what other people do and trusting that they've reasoned it out is what you're called to. And I think each of us is called to whatever decisions you're making around this kind of stuff to actually go through the process of decision making, to go through the reasoned thought of, like for me, I always come back to what's the message that I'm trying to communicate and what's the best way that the person I'm trying to communicate it to is going to be able to receive it. So that's like a little thing that I move through, but I've had to get there myself. And the advantage then of that is that when new situations come up, I have something to go back to. I'm not always having to go to other people. What are you going to do? What are you going to do? What should I do? Like having an own personal kind of decision-making thing, I think is really helpful. So that would be the first thing I reckon, is just to kind of look at what am I making my decisions out of? What is the process that I'm reasoning through?
The other thing I think is about being honest to who we are. Like, in real life, I'm a fairly reserved person anyway. So the fact that I sit back on Facebook and don't do very much at all, for instance, probably actually true to who I am.
Yeah.
But I'm also very conscious of not putting a curated self out there in lots of other ways, like creating an online persona.
Yes.
Okay, so maybe there's a pride and a vanity, and I'm not going to post like really dumb photos of me, but I don't actually post many photos anyway.
Yeah.
So something about, let's come back to being real, and if I can't post what's really on my heart and what I really think, or who I really am, what's really going on in my life, maybe there's a question I should be asking about why I'm posting at all. That truth is, it's not just a moral standard or a value, but there's something about integrity that's key to our humanity. And I think we actually do damage to ourselves when we're not living in the truth.
Yeah. And I've found it really helpful, kind of the distinction we came up with a few episodes ago of working critically within and creatively outside of. And I reckon that this is a really good example of critically within, of looking at, okay, the world is happening in this digital public sphere. But then I guess the question is, how do we evangelize creatively when this is kind of what's happening?
And I actually think one of the best examples of this is not new. I reckon Alpha's been out there since the early 90s. And to me, there's something in the Alpha movement that really speaks into all of this in a really wholesome way. If you think about it, okay, except for when on COVID, that some people went online, it's face-to-face.
Yeah, so for people that don't know what Alpha is, what is it?
Alpha is like a 15-week program for people inquiring basically about Christianity. Goes through topics from, what's life all about, who is Jesus, why did he have to die, what is faith, that kind of thing. And it's set up in a way that you have a meal together with a bunch of other people, And after the meal, you either hear a talk or watch a video that presents something of a Christian answer to that question. And then there's a time for conversation over the table. You know, what do you think? And it's very, like, the leaders of each table are trained that this is a space where people really are meant to be able to explain what they think with no judgment.
Right.
So, you know, I might totally disagree with what somebody says, and really the strongest response that they suggest I give would be, oh, that's an interesting point of view. Like, so I don't have to agree with what you say, but I have to leave the space for you to say it and give you the freedom to really get in touch with your own opinion and to explore in truth, in reality, what's going on inside of you as you listen to that talk or think about that subject area. And I think when I think about all of that, it's moving in the face of we only interact online because you're actually sitting physically with these people. There's something really grounding about having a meal together, bonding experience. We're listening to the same information, but then there's a freedom to share personal opinion in an atmosphere where no one's going to judge me. I'm welcome to come back next week, even if I say I thought that was a whole load of rubbish and I can't believe that anybody believes it.
Yeah.
But dinner was nice. Can I come back?
Yeah. Or one of our young people we had recently who was like, yeah, I might come next week. I'll see how I go. Always turned up kind of thing. But there's a freedom there. And I think one of the things that you're talking about is, I guess, in the digital space, you're more and more removed from the person you're engaging with. But something that Alpha's doing is you're having the discussion, yes, but there's more of our persons that are engaged in the discussion. Yeah, and there's something very human about it in my head, that we're coming back to something that this digital age is more and more drawing us away from, which is not just the face-to-face, but the grounded human, like even eating, rather than just taking a photo of my food and posting it. Like, there's something very human, very real, very concrete about all of these things. I'm really talking. I'm really eating. I don't have time to curate in a real-time conversation. I actually often just blurt out what's in my head. Yeah. And I guess we're seeing, you know, like some people might think of, I think when I first heard of Alpha, something in me went off of like, oh, that's a little bit daggy or something. Do you know what I mean? Like something might kind of sit there. But what we're seeing is that it's actually one of the most effective kind of modes of like baseline evangelization kind of happening in the Christian world at the moment.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, for all that the digital world absorbs us more and more, the reality is that as human beings, we're made for human contact. And that if we can create spaces for people just to meet, just to talk, just to feel like they matter to somebody in real time, to be fed, not just like physically fed, it's great, but there's a feeding of the heart. And if it's a good conversation, potentially a feeding of the mind. I think there's something that draws people back.
Yeah.
That opens people's hearts, that builds a relationship where the possibility of evangelization, which might not have been there in the first place, could grow. So that I know COVID made all sorts of online stuff possible, and that's been great in lots of ways. But I actually think baseline evangelization and face-to-face contact with real people and the experience that the real you is loved and lovable is a huge, huge part of what the world needs today in evangelization.
Yeah, and it's reminding me as well, I think we've mentioned it before, but one of our MGL brothers kind of wrote his thesis on looking at how discipleship and a discipleship model is actually the way forward for evangelization for this reason, and that now they're looking at actually running a large-scale youth group, probably not as effective as a small mentoring discipleship group, that even at a youth level, that this is, I guess, maybe a way that we're looking at, maybe this is more effective than what's happened in the past because of all these elements. It gives them a space for maybe having that meal together and spending time, like in a closer group where they feel like they're seen and heard and known, where they can have active discussion and feel accepted, all those kinds of things. And there's something around the personal relationship, being able to be, the more of the person that you are able to engage with, I guess, the more it releases something in us that's healing. And that is a proclamation of the gospel. That's what Jesus did. He came into people's homes. He had meals with them. He had conversations with them. He probably let them talk about whatever they wanted to talk about too. And yeah, I think it's the heart of the gospel kind of sits in this moving forward, I think.
Yeah, I'm thinking we were talking about the buffered self, the curated self, and there's something above and beyond that in the safety of a relationship where I feel known, I feel loved, where I can come out with a bizarre opinion and know before I do that you know me, you love me, you're going to interpret what I say in the context of who I am. You're not going to reject me, even though I'm pretty sure that you don't share this opinion or idea. And that I'm actually, because of all those things, willing to listen to what you have to say about it as well. That, this can be a two-way conversation because I feel safe with you.
Yes. Another element I'm just thinking about, like our local alpha that we run here, we've moved from having it in the parish hall to having it in the home. I think that's one of the ideas of the discipleship model as well in youth ministry, is even just an intimacy of physical place, that there's something about being in a home, right, that just evokes a vulnerability that I don't have in a parish hall where there's, wooden floors and all of that kind of thing. Like there's something as well about the space. Yeah, there's just a lot, I think, that we can work with if we really think about it and think about what's needed and the resources that we have.
So I wonder, moving forward from this, how would you, what would you give people as a takeaway moving forward out of this?
I think it always starts with the personal. And what we were talking before about, like, for me, I'd love to see a rise of developing own moral conscience and looking at self-reflection on, I guess, the elements of fear, that the rise of the nature of the public sphere at the moment, the way that that's impacting my capacity to have internal thought processes that I'm able to engage with other people, and my capacity to then express, who I really am, because I think there's a feeling of suppression. So just looking at, I think taking some time to look at, how am I curating myself? Why am I curating myself? Where am I held back by fear? And what's the particular mission that God's calling me to offer into the public sphere at this time?
I think I'd add to that a question of looking at where in my life do I have face-to-face personal relationships with people that I trust? And where in my life is there space for people that I want to reach out to have that kind of relationship with me?
That's really good. All right, well, this has been great, and I'll probably be thinking about it for a while. So I hope it's blessed you listening as well, and until next time, be well.
Amen.
This has been Contemplating Culture, a podcast produced by the Missionaries of God's Love Sisters. For more information from today's episode, be sure to check out the show notes. We pray that today has blessed you, and most importantly, we invite you to continue the conversation.